I only meant to fix her car door. But somewhere between the sound of the rain and her smile, I realized she was fixing something in me, too. It started with the sound of metal complaining. That tired, high-pitched squeak that follows you every time you open an old car door. She stood beside it, one hand on her hip, the other holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. "You're handier than you look," she said, her smile half teasing, half grateful. I laughed, trying to hide how nervous I was. The truth is, I didn't really know her. Just a neighbor I'd waved at a few times while leaving for class or coming home late. But that morning, when I saw her struggling with the door that wouldn't shut, I heard myself offering help before my mind caught up. The driveway was quiet, except for the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block and the steady tapping of rain starting to fall. She handed me a small towel, said, "So you don't ruin that shirt." And it was the way she said that shirt, casual but noticing, that made the air shift a little. The hinge was rusted, the bolt stripped. Nothing complicated, but enough to make me feel useful. I worked in silence, feeling her presence behind me. Every so often, she'd comment on the weather or ask if I needed another tool. But mostly she just watched, calm, patient, like someone who'd learned not to fill every quiet moment. When I looked up, she was leaning against the car, her hair tucked behind one ear, rain catching on the edge of her sleeve. There was something gentle about the way she carried herself, confident but not trying. You could tell she'd lived through things and come out softer, not harder. I tested the door. It finally shut with a smooth click. "Fixed," I said, brushing off my hands. She smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't need to be big to feel warm. "You saved me a trip to the mechanic," she said. "That's worth at least a coffee." I tried to decline, but she tilted her head, the corners of her eyes narrowing like she could already see through my polite excuses. "Come on," she said. "It's just coffee. Besides, it's starting to pour." For a second, I almost said no. But then a drop of rain hit the back of my neck, and she was already walking toward the house, calling over her shoulder, "The door's open!" I followed, maybe because it was raining, maybe because something about her tone felt like an invitation I didn't want to turn down. Inside, her home smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paperbacks. There was music playing softly, a record, not a playlist. And I realized then that fixing the car door was just the start. Something else had just opened, too. And I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I already knew I didn't want to leave. The sound of rain followed me inside, soft, steady, like the world outside was slowing down just enough for this moment to exist. Her house felt alive in a quiet way. Not spotless, but warm. Books stacked by the window, a half-finished painting leaning against the wall, a mug with a crack she hadn't bothered to throw away. It wasn't the kind of place that tried to impress you. It was the kind that made you breathe easier without knowing why. She moved around the kitchen like someone who'd done it 1,000 times, barefoot on the tiles, the hem of her sweater brushing just above her jeans. "Coffee?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Please," I said. The kettle hummed to life, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence, tapping against the glass. She reached for 2 mugs, then paused. "You take sugar?" "2," I replied. She smiled, not at the answer, but at the fact that I answered at all, like most people she knew didn't bother with small details anymore. "Good," she said. "I always make it too sweet anyway." She handed me the mug, and when our fingers brushed, there was that same charge again. Small, impossible to name, but enough to make the moment feel slightly suspended. We sat across from each other at a small wooden table, the kind that had probably hosted years of conversations. There was soft jazz playing from a speaker tucked behind a stack of books. Faint, imperfect, like the memory of a song rather than the song itself. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, "are you always this helpful? Or just trying to impress your neighbors?" I smiled. "Depends on the neighbor." She laughed. A low, genuine sound that made the corners of her eyes crease just a little. You could tell she didn't laugh like that often. As the conversation drifted, so did the walls between us. We talked about ordinary things, how rain smells different in every city, how mornings feel quieter when you're alone, how people stop asking if you're happy after a certain age. She told me she used to drive that car everywhere, road trips, visits, late-night escapes, but these days it mostly just sat in the driveway. It used to feel like freedom, she said, tracing the rim of her mug. Now it just feels parked. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't. I just listened, and I think that was what she needed most. Not an answer, just presence. When the rain grew heavier, she leaned back, eyes soft, distant. "You're easy to talk to," she said quietly, almost to herself. I smiled, though something in my chest tightened, because I realized it wasn't just the coffee that was warming me. It was her voice, her stillness, the quiet trust beginning to form between us. And as the rain blurred the outside world, it felt like, for the first time in a long time, neither of us needed to be anywhere else. When the rain finally eased, the world outside looked rinsed clean. Wet leaves clinging to the glass, streets shining under the gray light. We'd been talking for hours, though it didn't feel that way. Time had softened into something slower, something I didn't want to measure. I glanced at my phone, mostly out of habit. "I should probably let you get back to your day," I said, though every part of me resisted standing up. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides a sigh. "You've already saved it," she said. "But if you insist on being polite—" I stood, setting my empty mug on the counter. "Guess I'll head out before the next storm rolls in." She followed me to the door, her steps unhurried. There was no rush in her. She moved like someone who understood the beauty of leaving a moment unfinished. My jacket was still damp. My shoes squeaked against the floor. I bent to pick up my keys, and she noticed something I hadn't. The small wrench I'd left near the umbrella stand. "Don't forget your tool," she said softly, reaching for it. That's when it happened, that small, accidental thing that changes everything. Our fingers touched as she handed it over. Just skin on skin, warm, brief, familiar and strange at once. But neither of us let go. Not immediately. The air shifted, heavier, quieter. The sound of the rain outside felt distant, like it belonged to another world. I looked up, and she was already watching me. Her eyes didn't shy away. They were calm, steady, but carrying something that words would only ruin. She wasn't trying to flirt. I wasn't trying to read too much into it. Yet in that second, it was all there. The loneliness we hadn't spoken about, the years between us, the quiet gratitude of simply being seen. Her breath caught. Mine did too. Then she smiled, barely, like she was breaking her own rule, and pulled her hand back. "You should keep that," she said, nodding toward the wrench. "Just in case another door gives you trouble." I nodded, though I couldn't quite find my voice. Outside, the air smelled like wet asphalt and eucalyptus. I walked down the path, every step echoing against the quiet street. When I reached my car, I looked back once. She was still standing by the window, arms folded, half hidden behind the curtain. She didn't wave. I didn't either. But the look we shared through the glass said more than either of us could have managed with words. And as I drove away, I realized it wasn't the car door I kept thinking about. It was the way her fingers lingered, the way her eyes didn't flinch, the glance that stayed long after I was gone. I told myself I was just checking on the car door. That's what I said out loud when I turned into her street again, 3 days after the rain. But even I didn't believe it. The afternoon was warm, the kind that makes the air shimmer just above the pavement. Her house looked the same. Ivy creeping along the gate, a wind chime swaying lazily in the breeze. I saw her sitting on the porch steps with a book, her legs crossed, sunlight brushing against her hair. She looked up before I could even knock. "Back already?" she said, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Just making sure my fix held up," I replied, pretending to inspect the car parked by the curb. She laughed, a soft, knowing sound. "You could have just asked," she said. "Wouldn't be the same," I admitted. There was no awkwardness, no explanation needed. She stood, brushing off her jeans, and motioned for me to join her. "Well, since you're here, you might as well sit." I was just about to make some iced tea. I sat beside her on the porch. The wood was warm beneath us, and the sound of cicadas filled the pauses between our sentences. We didn't talk about much, just small things. How the neighborhood always smelled like rain even when it hadn't rained. How she'd started repainting her living room but hadn't finished because she couldn't decide on a color. But beneath it all was something quieter. A mutual awareness neither of us wanted to disturb. At one point, she reached out to brush something off my shoulder. A dry leaf that had drifted down from the tree above. Her fingers lingered for just a heartbeat too long. It was such a small gesture, yet it felt charged, deliberate in its hesitation. "You missed a spot," she said softly, but her hands stayed there a second longer before falling away. The sun was starting to dip, the sky turning the color of peach and dust. She glanced toward the horizon, her voice low. "You remind me of a time when everything still felt possible." I didn't know how to answer that, not without saying too much. So I just said, "Maybe it still is." She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her eyes shifted. Not longing exactly, but recognition. Like she'd been waiting for someone to remind her what hope looked like. And somehow it showed up with a wrench and a half smile. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't say goodbye. Just watched me with that same small smile, like she already knew I'd come back again. And as I walked away, the wind caught her wind chime, filling the air with soft, uneven notes. The kind that sound like the start of something that doesn't know what it's becoming yet. It was late afternoon when I stopped by again. I told myself I was returning her screwdriver, though it had been sitting in my car for days, waiting for an excuse. The air smelled like rain again, though the sky hadn't decided whether to keep its promise. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been expecting it. "I was wondering when that tool would find its way back," she said, smiling softly. Inside, the light was dim and golden. She had music playing again, something older, slower, the kind of song that feels like it knows what you're trying not to say. "Stay for a bit?" she asked. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, facing each other. The same mugs as before, the same soft rhythm of rain starting up again outside. For a while we talked about nothing. Neighbors, the noise from the construction down the street, how time feels strange lately. But gradually, the spaces between our words started to stretch. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's waiting. She broke it first. "You ever feel like you just stopped somewhere along the way?" she said quietly, eyes on her mug. "Like life kept going without you?" I looked at her, really looked. The way her hands wrapped around the cup, the faint tremor in her voice. "Yeah," I said. "I feel that a lot." She gave a small, almost relieved laugh. "People assume you stop feeling that way once you're older, but it just changes shape." There was something raw in her tone. Not sadness, exactly, but truth that hadn't been spoken in a long time. I wanted to tell her how much I admired her, how her presence felt grounding in a world that never stopped rushing. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "You don't seem like someone who's stopped. You seem like someone who's just paused to breathe." Her eyes lifted to mine, and in that look, everything slowed. She reached across the table, hesitated, then placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her grip gentle but certain. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet. It was gratitude, connection, recognition. We sat like that for a long time. No music, no words, just rain against the windows and her thumb tracing small circles over my knuckles. Then she said, almost as if to herself, "You listen differently. Most people just wait for their turn to talk." I smiled. "Maybe I just don't want to miss anything." Her lips curved, soft and wistful. "Don't start saying things like that," she said with a quiet laugh, "or I might start believing them." Neither of us moved to break the silence after that. It wasn't awkward, it was full, alive. And somewhere between her hand on mine and the rain outside, I realized something had changed. We hadn't confessed anything aloud, but both of us knew. Some things don't need to be said to be true. That evening, the sky was heavy with thunder, the kind that waits, rumbling far off, warning you before it arrives. I hadn't planned to stop by. I just found myself there again, her porch light glowing faintly through the mist. I told myself it was because I'd promised to check on the car door one last time. But deep down, I knew better. She opened the door before I could knock, smiling like she already knew the truth. "You're terrible at pretending you just happened to be in the neighborhood," she said. I grinned. "Caught me again. Come in before the storm starts," she said softly. Inside, the house felt different tonight. The air was warm, thick with that scent of rain-soaked air and brewed tea. The lights were dim, golden, and calm. A record spun in the corner, low and crackling. We sat in the living room, both quiet. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the silences between us. She glanced toward the window. "It's funny," she said, "how some people just appear in your life and feel like they were supposed to be there all along." I nodded slowly. "And others leave, and it feels like they took a piece of you with them." Her eyes softened, catching mine. "You ever think maybe that's why we hold back? Because we know what it's like to lose something that mattered." I didn't answer. I just looked at her. The faint lines near her eyes, the quiet confidence in her voice, the way her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve when she got thoughtful. When the thunder finally broke, she flinched, almost imperceptibly. I reached out without thinking, my hand brushing over hers. She didn't pull away this time. The rain came hard, tapping, then pouring, washing the world in sound. "I should go," I said quietly after a while, though even saying it felt wrong. She looked at me for a long time. Not sad, not hesitant, just certain. Then she said it softly, almost like a whisper that filled the entire room. "Now you're not leaving." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even about staying the night. It was about staying present, staying open, staying where something real was happening. The way she said it wasn't about possession, it was about connection. Like she finally allowed herself to want something again, without fear. I didn't move toward her, and she didn't move toward me. We just sat there, hands barely touching, the warmth between us stronger than any words. Outside, the rain kept falling, endless, forgiving. And in that soft, suspended moment, I understood what she meant. I wasn't leaving. Not her. Not the peace that had settled between us. Sometimes the heart just knows when it's home. A few weeks passed before I saw her again. The rain had given way to long, pale mornings, that soft kind of sunlight that makes everything look gentler than it really is. Her street looked different in daylight. The flowers she'd planted were blooming. Her wind chime barely stirred in the warm breeze. When I pulled up, she was already outside, wiping her hands on a rag, standing beside the car I'd fixed. "Still working?" I asked, nodding toward the door. She smiled. "Perfectly. You might have a new calling." I walked over, pulled the handle, and listened to that smooth, quiet click. The hinge held steady. "Guess I did something right," I said. She looked at me. The same way she had that night, though lighter now, freer. "You did," she said, and I knew she wasn't talking about the door. She motioned toward the porch. "Coffee?" "Always," I replied. We sat in the same spots as before, but everything felt changed. Not new, not uncertain, just settled. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, like a well-worn rhythm that didn't need to be explained. She asked about my work, my plans, the small things. I told her how busy things had gotten, how strange it felt that my days still seemed to drift back toward her street. "Maybe you like quiet places," she said. "Maybe I like good company," I answered. Her laugh was soft, but her eyes held mine for a little too long, that same wordless understanding passing between us. The sunlight slipped through the porch railings, catching dust in the air like slow-moving gold. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a second. "It's strange," she said, "how something as small as a broken hinge can bring people together." "Maybe that's how it works," I said. "Something breaks so something else can start." She smiled, turning her face toward me. "You always make things sound simpler than they are." "Maybe they are simple," I said quietly. "We just make them complicated because we're afraid to believe the good parts." For a while, we just sat there, listening to the wind and the distant hum of a passing car. There wasn't a grand declaration, no promise of forever. Just two people who'd learned to breathe easier around each other. Before I left, she walked me to the car. "You know," she said, "that door still opens smoother than the day I bought it." I smiled. "Guess some things are meant to stay fixed." She looked at me, steady, gentle. "Some are," she said. When I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror once. She was still there, standing by the porch, a faint smile on her lips, framed by morning light. And I realized that what we built wasn't just a moment. It was a kind of quiet understanding, the kind that doesn't fade when you close the door behind you. Some fixes, it turns out, are meant to last. A few weeks passed before I saw her again. The rain had given way to long, pale mornings, that soft kind of sunlight that makes everything look gentler than it really is. Her street looked different in daylight. The flowers she'd planted were blooming. Her wind chime barely stirred in the warm breeze. When I pulled up, she was already outside, wiping her hands on a rag, standing beside the car I'd fixed. "Still working?" I asked, nodding toward the door. She smiled. "Perfectly. You might have a new calling."